Hi, I'm Sam with Gone Photography. In today's video, we're going to be talking about autofocus points and exposure. Now, autofocus points are these. These are the different points on your camera that you can focus on a different person, a subject, an object, or whatever. Usually, for me, I choose this very center one. So, for you, how to change your autofocus point, you need to find this button. A different spot on some Canon cameras, but most of the time it's going to be right here, and you're going to change it with this wheel. Or if you're a newer camera, you might be able to change it on an LCD screen on the back, a touchpad or something like that, but all of it's the same. If you notice that all of the points are lit up though, that means that your camera is going to choose an autofocus point that it thinks is the correct one. So as a new beginner, this might be a good way to go, but I'm a big fan of doing just straight in the middle. I don't take a lot of subject pictures with a lot of subjects, just usually like one person, especially sports. So you can focus on that very center person, put them in the very middle of the picture, and have the most room to work around them. So I'm going to show an example here of two different autofocus points and how it's going to affect your camera, the picture that you take. Now, these pictures are taken with a very low aperture, so the depth of field is very small. So with your standard kit lens, you probably won't run into this problem as much. This is kind of for, like, you know, those shots with the bride and groom in the front and the people in the back are blurry, that kind of situation. You need to change the autofocus points, or even taking a picture of a large group of people, just in case, you know, maybe there's a gap in the middle, you don't want to just turn your camera to the side. You can just change one of the autofocus points. So this first one, the car, I turn the autofocus point down to the bottom left right on the car, and the other stuff is blurry and distorted. And so on the second picture, I move the autofocus point to the top right, where the little cardboard G's are. And so the car is out of focus. So this is just one example of the way you might need to change your autofocus point. And I just wanted to make sure that before we continue on any other videos, if I say autofocus or focusing on this, you'll understand that you can change your autofocus point based on your subjects, based on the things you might be shooting. But for the most part, I think a lot of you will stick with either the full autofocus, just everything highlighted, or the very center one. So that's my recommendation on autofocus. Now let's talk about exposure. Okay, so now let's talk about exposure. The diagram we're going to show you first is the exposure reading on your camera. Right in the middle is a good exposure of both dark and light. If you go to the right, you get brighter image, more light. To the left, darker image, less light. Now let's go to an example of each. Now this is three different pictures. The first one on the far left is dark, so it's set to -3 exposure. The middle one is set to 0, and the far right one is set to +3. And you'll notice how it affects the image quality, or the image the way it is. So usually when farther and more advanced lessons, we'll learn about aperture, shutter speed, ISO, but all of these things will affect your outcome of your picture. So this is not so much as something you need to know, but something you need to realize when you're maybe looking down the viewfinder with your settings currently the way you want them, whether it be for sports, whether it be for a low aperture for a nice good portrait shot, or even an item of a product. You'll be able to tell exactly what the exposure is going to be. So a lot of these pictures, I'm going to show you an example. This picture is a picture of the moon. Now, you might be thinking, oh, it's so beautiful, it must be at 0. No, this was actually taken at, I think, -2.5, because look at all the black. That black is going to affect the way the image is on the exposure meter. Now, the one other thing you need to really look at, this is another picture from the back of the camera, and this is the metering of your camera. There's 4 different types of metering. The one that is shown is the evaluative metering. So this is just the standard on most cameras. They usually come like this, starting off. And so what it does is it takes the entire picture and it figures out what the exposure is going to be based on the entire picture. If you have just a dot in the middle, that is called small circle, which means it just takes where you're pointing at, whatever your dot is in your autofocus, it'll take a little tiny area around there and it'll tell you the exposure of that little area. Next will be just the parentheses, and that is a partial metering, which means it takes a little bit larger circle and it tells you what is in that. Another one is just the outer square, and that's the center weighted average. So if, as a new photographer, I would stick with the evaluative metering. It's pretty standard. It's going to take the whole image. We'll talk about some stuff in, like, when we get to sports photography and other stuff like that, where we'll talk about spot metering, which I use a lot just to be able, because I don't want to, I know that the sky is pitch black. I want to know exactly on that player what the exposure is. So that's just one little thing about exposure that you need to know. We'll talk about it again in a future episode, in a future time, when we're talking about ISO and aperture and shutter speed and how it affects the exposure. So that's just my rundown of just a quick little pointers. If you'd like to start taking pictures with your camera and you want me to recommend a first setting, go to the P setting on your camera, and it'll allow you to set your exposure and your ISO. So exposure, you can set it to wherever you want, and it'll automatically choose the best aperture and the best shutter speed to get that exposure. And you can set the ISO. Just a quick rundown of ISO. When you're taking the pictures, the higher the ISO, the more light gets on the sensor, so the brighter the picture can be in a low light situation, but the grainier the picture. So I wouldn't go above 1,000 while you're practicing, but we'll talk about ISO on a later episode in more detail, probably with shutter speed or aperture, one of the other ones. So we'll talk about that in a later episode. The first thing I just wanted you guys to understand was exactly what exposure is and what autofocus and how to focus your camera. So those are the two kind of things I wanted to talk about this episode. I'm really happy you guys are here. I hope you guys subscribe to my channel and check out the rest of my videos if you want to figure out how to buy a camera body or buy a lens. And if you want to see future videos on how to take the best picture possible, please subscribe to my channel.